Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books, and today we are here for a quick January wrap-up. Now, January was such a good start to 2024. I read some fantastic books and I'm pretty happy with the number of books that I got through as well. I also participated in a couple different readathons. The primary one was TBR-a-thon, which was hosted by Leandra, the TBR Zero. This was a lot of fun. I didn't get to participate in as many reading sprints and things as I would have liked because I have a weird work schedule and unfortunately I'm working when a lot of people are off and participating in fun stuff. But I did really enjoy using her TBR boards to get through some of my reading. It really helped me to knock some of the books off of my list this month. So thank you for that, Leandra. And I also really appreciated all of the fun activities and like the community spirit that she had within this TBR. There was a great Discord chat. There was a lot of fun videos, reading sprints, and all sorts of cool stuff. So I will definitely participate in Leandra's future readathons. And I also participated in a readathon on Bookstagram that is focused on diversifying your reading habits. And that's going on all year long. So you just post your readathon board with updates of what you've read for each prompt every single month. And then the hosts of the readathon are keeping track of that. And I'm pretty pleased to say that I knocked out, I think 6 or 7 prompts in the month of January. They're aiming for 1 or 2 prompts a month, but I anticipate that I should be able to fill this TBR card at least once every 2 months, if not more than that. So let's go ahead and jump into some statistics. In January, I completed 21 books. I'm pretty pleased with that number. That's right in line with what I usually do, between 20 to 25 books. Total pages for the month were 7,927 pages. Again, kind of right around the average. That said, my average pages per book was a little bit higher than usual, and it was at 377 pages, so I was happy about that. It means that I picked up some longer books this month. In terms of my page count, 14% of my books were under 300 pages. 81% of my books were between 300 and 500 pages. And only 5% of my books were above 500 pages. My top 5 genres this month were literary fiction, LGBTQIA, historical fiction. No surprise there, those are all genres that I typically enjoy. As I mentioned in my 2024 goals, one of my big goals was to increase the amount of nonfiction that I'm reading this year. So let's see how I did there. 14% of my reads this month were nonfiction and 86% were fiction. That means that I read 3 nonfiction books, which is better than my usual average of 1 to 2 nonfiction books. So I'm pleased to see some progress there. My longest read was Our Share of Night, which came in at 736 pages. My shortest book was M at 148 pages. Now let's get into the rating breakdown. I am so happy this month I had no 2-star reads, so that's very exciting. So we're gonna jump directly into my 3-star reads. First up, we're gonna talk about Holiday Country by Inci Atrek. This is a book that I did an entire review on, so if you want more details, you can see it up here. But this is a story about a young girl. She's coming of age in a seaside town in Turkey. She's from the States, but her family is originally from Turkey, and she kind of feels trapped between 2 cultures, a little bit isolated on both ends. And she ends up in a sort of illicit romance as a way to try to come to terms with her cultural identity. This book was very beautiful and lyrical in its writing. The prose was beautiful. Unfortunately for me, the plot points seemed completely unrealistic. The motivation for the main character seemed absurd, and I found almost every single character in this book unlikable. Then I had Rabbit Hole by Kate Brody. This is another book that I reviewed in its entirety up here. This is a book about a young woman whose sister was murdered, and then her father falls down a rabbit hole trying to investigate this murder online, and he ends up killing himself. Then she finds herself going down that same rabbit hole, and it leads her into an entanglement with an online investigator. This was what I thought was going to be a psychological thriller, and it really turned more into an emotional exploration of somebody that's in a downward spiral. While I thought there were some interesting points to this concept, and I did think that the author really nailed the support that you might receive in an online community, I didn't love the animal cruelty. I didn't love all of the psychological aspects, and there was some very graphic and uncomfortable sex scenes in the book that kind of put me off as well. I think there's a very specific type of reader for this book, and I just think it's probably not me. And then I read Rouge by Mona Awad. This is on the higher end of the 3 stars, but it didn't quite make it to a 4-star for me. This is one of those types of books that is like a fever dream. I think Mona Awad is pretty well known for that. She did something similar in Bunny, and I really loved it in that particular instance. In this book, I'm not sure if it worked the same way. Maybe it's because I had already read Bunny, so this wasn't as surprising. I had already seen some of these tricks, or maybe it's just the content of this particular particular story. But basically we have a young woman whose mother has passed away. She flies from Montreal to San Diego where her mother was living. And while she is there, she is invited to her mother's very private and exclusive spa. And then she comes to find out that this spa has some deep, dark secrets that she wasn't anticipating. Overall, I had fun reading this book. I don't think it was a bad book. I just don't think it felt as fresh or as original to me as Bunny did when I first read it. Then I had Womb City by Tlotlo Tsamasse. This was a dystopian fic set in Botswana. I have a full-scale review up here, but basically the government and men have absolute control of the bodies of women. Women are implanted with chips that monitor their every movements, their thoughts, the things that they say, and then they are reviewed daily by their husbands and then annually by the government. And we have a main character whose consciousness has been transplanted from their old body into a new body. There's all sorts of complex sciencey stuff going on, but essentially a murder happens and a vengeful ghost starts tracking down and killing people. And our main character has to figure out why this vengeful ghost is doing what they're doing. I love a good dystopian fic. I especially love it when it tackles really deep and heavy themes. This book does that exceedingly well. It covers so much ground, and in fact, I think that might actually be the problem with the book, is it tries to do too much in too short of a space. This author wrote this as a debut novel and it's extremely ambitious, but I think it would have been better served had it been broken into 3 separate books and written as a series. I think a lot of the events within the story needed more time to breathe to allow for some emotional impact. Then I had Noopiming by Leanne Betasamosake Simpson. This was a book that I was really looking forward to, and it was an interesting experience for me. I absolutely loved the writing style of this book. It was very beautiful, prosy, and even had kind of a dreamlike quality to it, but I'm just not sure that I understood all of it. We have a being that is coming alive from like under the ice, and then there's 7 different stories that are told to represent different parts of this being. And it was an enjoyable read. Like I said, it was really beautiful, but I just think a lot of it went over my head. Then I had The Longest Autumn by Amy Avery. This was a book that I expected to be a little bit more along the lines of a mythological retelling. We have a young woman who is the escort of Autumn. So as the seasons change, the escort escorts the gods through a special magical mirror, and that is the start of the next season. It's always gone fine, but this year the mirror breaks and Autumn and this young woman are stuck in the world. And the more time that Autumn spends in the world, the more he becomes human-like. He starts to have illicit feelings for his escort, and she starts to struggle with whether she should pursue a relationship with the god or not. Again, this is one of those books where I feel like it had a really cool concept, but the execution was off for me. I felt like this book, instead of focusing on the fantasy elements and the mythological elements, which were really cool and really interesting, was more interested in focusing on sex and romance. I have no problem with either. However, I did feel like the sex started to feel a little bit gratuitous in this book. There were certainly scenes that were not necessary to the plot. Overall, it was a fun enough read if you just want something that's light and fluffy and a little bit romance heavy. Then I had Dazzling by Chikodili and Melumadu. This is a Nigerian fantasy that features a young girl who has inherited an animal spirit from her father, and then she gets shipped off to school, and she's kind of struggling to fit in her school, and she's struggling with the spirit presence in her life, and there's just a lot going on. It was a really interesting start to a series. There were some really great aspects in it. Our main character is interesting because she's not brave and strong and naturally like outspoken. She's actually much more quiet and shy, and she's kind of an outsider. She's not very popular, and I loved that. I think that was such a nice departure from, you know, the girl that is just automatically good at everything right off the bat. You can definitely see this character growing throughout the series. And then I had The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. This is a book that I was surprised to put in the 3-star category, and that's because this book won a Booker Prize and it has gotten so much critical acclaim. I read this book as part of this banned book project that I've been working on and I'm hoping to start posting about in February. But this is a book that's set in India. It follows a dysfunctional family. The main focus of the story is a set of fraternal twins and their mother. This book is full of illicit and controversial relationships based upon the standards of the time. Some of the things that happen in the book wouldn't be considered controversial nowadays, but at the time of writing, they were extremely controversial. And then there are some things that happen in this book that are still controversial and very taboo today. I thought that the writing in this book was really lovely. I thought that the characters were complex and interesting. A lot of the characters were very unlikable, but unlikable in a way that makes sense with the book. Not unlikable in the way where you're like, ugh, I can't believe I'm reading this book. I think my main quarrel with this story is that I felt a big disconnect with the emotional content of this book. There are many things that happen in this book that should be very emotional, and I just never really felt any depth. But that could definitely be just a me thing. Now let's get into our 4-star reads. First up is Mercury by Anna Jo Burns. I have a recipe and review up here that was inspired by this book, and this is another book about a dysfunctional family. We have a family that lives in a small town, and they sort of adopt this young woman. She ends up marrying one of the sons, and we follow this family as they try to keep their roofing business together, try to keep their family from tearing each other apart. This is an interesting book. The family is dysfunctional, but each individual character, for the most part, is pretty likable, and I did find myself rooting for some of the characters and relating to some of the characters. I did find parts of the story a bit predictable, but all in all, I thought this was an enjoyable read, and I especially liked the way that this was really anchored in its setting. Then I had Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. This is a book I've been meaning to read forever, and this was just a good old-fashioned fun fantasy. We have a young woman who is orphaned and grows up in a magical library. She becomes the keeper of the books at the library, and then there is an attack and she is blamed for the death of one of the head librarians. She's taken to a trial, and there she meets a mysterious gentleman, and the two of them team up to find out what is going on with these magical libraries. This definitely wasn't the most profound read, and I'm kind of glad. I think with some of the heavier reading I did this month, I really needed just a break to relax and enjoy a fun story. This definitely is that. If you like a quick, easy, fun fantasy with plots that will keep you engaged but won't make you work too hard, this is a great book. Then I read Shark Heart by Emily Habeck, and this is a book that is a tale of two stories for me. The first half of this book was fantastic. I was so engaged and so intensely curious about what was going to happen. The story of this couple was so heartbreaking and emotional and moving. And then we got to the 50% point and it just went so off the rails. For me, the first half could have been a 5-star read, and then the second half was more like a 3-star read. And so it kind of averaged out to a 4-star read for me. But yeah, if it had been that first half of the book, had been the whole book, I would have definitely rated it at 5 stars. Then we have Sister Mother Warrior by Vanessa Riley. This is a book that is basically about the women who helped lead the Haitian Revolution. We have one woman who was a warrior from Africa who becomes a warrior and a general within the Haitian army, and then another woman who ends up marrying the future leader of Haiti. Both women are strong, independent, have very interesting viewpoints, and I thought it was really fantastic getting to know each of these different characters. What stopped this book from being 5 stars was for me that it was overly ambitious. There was so much that happened. This covered such a large space of time and so many main characters and side characters, and it flashes forward and it flashes backwards and it's dual timelines. Again, the content was fantastic. I learned so much from this book, but I think it would have been better as a duology had one book been dedicated to one woman and then the second book had been dedicated to the other woman. It's definitely at times hard to kind of keep track of everything that was going on, but I was super engaged. I read this whole thing, and it's not a short book. I read the whole thing in, I want to say, 2 days. Then I had M by Kim Thuy. This is a book of vignettes about the Vietnamese diaspora and Vietnamese people all over the world. These stories are very short. Some of them are less than a page long. Some of them are about a page and a half. But the thing that they all have in common is that they're very beautiful, and I think that they really capture the feelings of being far away from home. I think this was a lovely read. Then I had Making It So by Sir Patrick Stewart. This was a joy to read. This is a memoir of Patrick Stewart's life. He talks about his childhood, he talks about growing up, he talks about getting into the Royal Shakespeare Company, and then he ends up talking about Star Trek and X-Men and all of the things that he's done since. I will say that this isn't the deepest, most emotional memoir. It's very superficial in that he talks about things that are potentially very emotional for him, but not in any great detail or great depth. He mostly alludes to them, and then he focuses mostly on his profession, on his acting, his career, the Royal Shakespeare Company, Star Trek, all of that. Now, as a big fan of Sir Patrick Stewart, I still found this very interesting, and I actually listened to it on audiobook, and I think that makes it all the better because he narrates it himself, so you hear everything in his voice. Then I had Davos Man by Peter S. Goodman. This talks about the Davos Convention and how all the wealthiest people in the world get together every year and essentially decide the direction of the world. They interfere in how countries are governed. They have influenced the laws that affect corporations in many different countries. And this book actually talks about economic structures in several different countries that Davos has directly affected. And this isn't all conspiracy theories either. This is good old-fashioned journalism and reporting. My only critique of this book is that this is nonfiction, and I think in nonfiction I prefer a style where the author is reporting based on fact. And while the author accomplishes that most of the time in this book, there are moments where his own personal opinion clearly bleeds through the story. After that, I read You Exist Too Much by Zaina Arafat. This is a book that I read for another book club, and it features a young girl who is coming to terms with her sexuality and with her abusive relationship with her mother. We have this young girl who's really searching for some sort of connection or some way to relate with her mom, and every time that she tries to reach out to her, it ends up in screaming and insults and tearing her down. And it was painful to read, honestly. I really felt for our main character in the story. I thought the way that she was dealing with her sexuality and trying to balance her culture and her parents' desires and her own desires and her own needs was really interesting. I thought that overall it was pretty well done. A lot of the characters in this book are very unlikable, so it was hard in some ways to read. Not always the most enjoyable read, but I did think that it covered a lot of really important topics. The first of my 5 stars is No Soy Roto by Jesse Leon. This is a memoir about Jesse's life growing up. He had immigrant parents, he's dealing with his own sexuality, he has drug addiction problems, he has trauma in his life that he's trying to deal with, and then he eventually overcomes all of these different obstacles and makes his way to Harvard. This is such a beautiful memoir. Jesse does such a good job with the storytelling. He makes you feel like you're listening to your best friend tell you about their lives. He's very conversational in his storytelling. And I just thought that this book was really inspiring. You can see how he overcame a multitude of obstacles to get to one of the most renowned schools in the world. Jesse Leon is from San Diego, and as a fellow San Diegan, I just felt so much pride in reading his story. I really recommend this book. Whether you read it in Spanish or you read it in English, I think it is a fantastic read. Next up, I have All the Little Bird Hearts by Victoria Lloyd-Barlow. This was a book that received a lot of attention around Booker Prize season. I believe it was on the long list, and I can't remember if it made it to the short list or not. But I must have missed the reviews of it, or I just completely forgot what they were about, because I went into the story and was completely surprised by what I found. We have a main character who is very clearly autistic. However, she is living in a time period where there is no autism diagnosis, and so nobody knows what her deal is. We see the whole story through her eyes, and so we get to see just how weird everyone is to her as well. She doesn't understand why people behave the way they do. She has all of these idiosyncrasies that make sense to her, and she doesn't understand how other people don't operate that way. She's a single mother raising a teenager, and she's having a hard time relating with her child and her child's desire for independence and freedom. She also has some new neighbors that move in next door, and at first she has a beautiful friendship with the wife in the couple, but then that starts to come with its own problems. One thing that I think this book does exceedingly well is it forces you to feel some compassion and some empathy for people who don't relate to the world and to social structures in the same way, especially in a time frame where there weren't diagnoses and terms for what was happening with this woman. It really makes you think as a reader about how isolating of an experience it must have been to be autistic in a time period when nobody was aware of what autism was. After that, I have Evil Eye by Etaf Rum, and this is a book that I am not at all surprised to see in the 5-star category. I was pretty much expecting to really enjoy this book, and I pretty much did. We have a woman who is really struggling with her place in life. She was in an arranged marriage, and although her husband is fairly progressive, she just feels like things are not working very well. She has a desire for a career. She wants to travel the world. There's so much that she wants to do, and she feels that her husband stops her from doing those things. Now, her husband supports her getting an education. He supports her having a job. And when it's clear that she's having mental health issues, he's very supportive if she wants to quit the job and just be a stay-at-home mom. But he doesn't support her dreams of traveling. He doesn't support her passion for art. And I think at the end of the day, he sort of sees her career as something like a hobby that she's going to do part-time for a while until she gets bored of it, and then she just goes to be a stay-at-home mom. I really appreciated the exploration of a relationship where things aren't necessarily obviously broken initially, but there are things that are definitely not quite right. Oftentimes when we think of the end of a relationship, we think of something severe and dramatic like an affair or, horrible fighting. And that's not the case here initially. We have a relationship that is pretty much working, and yet our MC still feels unfulfilled. And there is all of this cultural pressure on her to stay in her marriage and to never get divorced. I thought it was really interesting seeing our MC try to work through all of that. This was a really beautifully done book. I think Etaf Rum is a fantastic writer, and I think most people will probably enjoy this book. Then I had Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This is a book that I was so looking forward to reading, and again, not surprised to see this in the 5-star category. This is sort of a blend of literary fiction, horror, historical fiction. It's set in Argentina during La Guerra Sucia. We have vampires, we have magic. There's just so much going on. I can't adequately describe this book to you, but there is a reason this was on everybody's best of 2023 list, and that's because it's a fantastic read. I devoured this book. It's super long. It comes in at like 730 some pages, and it felt like it was like a 300-page book. It read like a thriller for me. I kept going page after page because I had to know what was happening. And yeah, this was just such a creative and interesting concept. If you haven't read this one, this is something that should be on your list. And finally, we have The Storm We Made by Vanessa Chan. I was so excited about this book. I read a ton of historical fiction, and in reading a ton of historical fiction, I have read a lot of books that were in the World War II era. However, I found that most of those books feature the conflict in Europe, or if they're set in Asia, it's usually in China or in Korea. So I was thrilled when I saw that this book was going to be taking place in Malaysia. I really appreciated that this book did two things well. It talked about Malaysia under the British colonial rule, and then it talked about Malaysia under Japanese rule. And there's this optimism when the Japanese were coming into Malaysia initially, and then they realized how brutal Japanese rule is going to be. Chan definitely does not hold any punches in this story. This is very brutal. There is some extremely triggering content in this book. If you're considering reading it, you should absolutely read the trigger warnings because there are definitely some very violent and very graphic scenes. That being said, none of it was gratuitous. It all made sense with what was happening to the various characters within this story. And one of the things I really loved about this story is that this book basically follows every single character in a family. So we see literally how this whole family survives this war. It doesn't get confusing, even though there's multiple timelines and different POVs. It is handled spectacularly well. This was a fantastic read. If you're a fan of historical fiction, and in particular, if you like reading aspects of historical fiction that are a little on the lesser known side of things, this is a book you should definitely check out. So at the end of all that, my average rating for the month was a 3.85. That's pretty decent. It's a little higher than usual. And to me, that means it was a solid reading month. My favorite book in January was a tie between Our Share of Night and The Storm We Made. Both books were fantastic, and I can't recommend them enough. All the Little Bird Hearts was a close second as well. It was tough competition for that #1 spot. My least favorite read of the month was probably Rabbit Hole by Kate Brody. It's not a bad book, but I think it's a book that has a very specific type of reader. And for me, it was really hard getting through the animal cruelty, the really uncomfortable sex scenes, and just some of the violence and chaos that was in the book. This story overall had some interesting points, but it just wasn't enough for me to get past some of the gratuitous violence that was happening. So that's everything I have to say for the month of January. I hope that you found this interesting. If you did, hit the thumbs up button, comment down below, and let me know all about your January reading. How many books did you get to? What was your favorite, your least favorite? any books that you read in the month of January that you think I should be putting on my TBR, any of the books that I talked about that you really want to read, tell me everything. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell so that you never miss a video. And that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.